Hi, my name is Alex Williams, founder of the Newstack, and you are listening to the Newstack Analyst Podcast. We look at application development and management at scale. Nuage Networks is a sponsor of our ebook series on Docker and the container ecosystem. Learn more about Nuage and its perspectives on these timely and important topics in our latest ebook about networking, security, and storage in the Docker and container ecosystem. It's available for download at thenewstack.io. Now let's get to the show. Hey, it's Alex Williams of the Newstack, here to talk about some issues that I'm really interested in related to networking, security, and storage. It's the topic of our next ebook. With us today is the team from Nuage, who's doing some pretty interesting things. Nuage is a sponsor of the ebook. And I'm also joined by Ben Ball, technical editor at the Newstack, who manages the ebooks. Thank you all for being here.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Thank you.
So the Nuage team, tell us who you are.
Hey, Alex. This is Harmeet, Sahni. I'm from the product management team at Nuage, and I am leading the strategy for container networking and hybrid cloud.
Hey, Alex. This is Krishnan, again from product management at Nuage, leading strategy for security.
Excellent. Well, we've had a few conversations up to this point, and one of the topics I just would like to just to focus on from the beginning is we've covered this world for the Docker and container ecosystem pretty closely over the past 2 years, really since the Newstack got started, and we know the evolution, right? We've seen the uses for containers with developers for in terms of application packaging, but now we're seeing now with the proliferation of containers and how do you manage containers and how do you orchestrate containers, it's bringing in a lot of new questions about networking, security, and storage, questions I think that are very new to people. And so, I would just love to get your guys, 10,000 foot look at, at the ecosystem right now and how you view it.
Yeah, let me take a crack at that, Alex. This is Harmeet. So, this is such a dynamic space, right? I mean, we've seen so many different players trying to do different things. So I think it's very interesting, and there's no clear winners at this point, at least, right? But what we're doing is we're focusing on really the problems that we know how to solve well, which is just policy-based automation of networking and security. Now, what we are making sure is that we work with the different ecosystems so that we support the choices our customers make, right? So we're not saying, X is better than Y. We're just making sure that whether they pick something like Kubernetes or Mesos or Docker Swarm, any of those, ecosystems, we want to, make sure our customers, when they pick us, they know that they can switch between any of those choices and Nuage can help them out there. I mean, we're doing, a bunch of different work, right? There's so many startups. For example, we're doing some very interesting work with a company called Rancher, for example. We're doing work with the CoreOS guys, right? A lot of different things, but you know what? We're here to support our customers.
Rancher, those are very interesting companies, Rancher and CoreOS. I know they have particular perspectives about networking. What is, for instance, the perspectives and context for your conversations with Rancher?
Yeah, so the Rancher, one of the things that I think they're doing very well is sort of with the Rack HD part of, of course they have the Rancher OS, but I think what's really neat coming out of that is the stuff, that really to help you, how do you deploy, your container environment, right? That's kind of what the problem, that's an interesting problem they've picked, and I think they've solved it exceedingly well at this point. So that's kind of where we are working with them is we've got this large, creative sort of software company, and they said, you know what, we want Rancher to deploy you guys along with deploying, whether it's Docker or Mesos, whatever it is that they choose, but work with Rancher so that when we're ready to deploy our application, you guys go along with that.
Ben, I'm going to let you ask the next question. What is on your mind as you're developing these ebooks and your questions about, these topics of, for instance, SDN and how it applies to like policy-based management, or just generally, what are some of the those top-level questions that you're thinking about right now that you'd like to discuss here?
Well, obviously, Alex, it's kind of a difficult thing to approach this ecosystem, and these are all fairly overlapping topics that we're covering in this book. And kind of really the first question I have for Nuage, and I think this is important, I think, for establishing this conversation, is essentially why an SDN approach to any of these solutions, really, over maybe, I don't want to say traditional networking models, but other choices, because I think that's something that I want to understand better, and I think it's something that probably our listeners would like to understand better. What specifically about the SDN approach do you think is beneficial and going to help you more?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really good question, and something that we care about a lot, right? If you think about this whole container ecosystem, I mean, this is all about being able to create applications, cloud native applications which you want to stand up very quickly. You want to scale out very quickly, scale them down, roll out new versions, all of that, right? And what you want is an infrastructure that doesn't become a bottleneck, right? So if you look at traditional approaches, it becomes very hard, because what you want to do is, you're not going to get that flexibility, that programmability. And that's where SDN comes in. I mean, you can literally, start thinking of, people are talking about infrastructure as code, and SDN really done the right way is really that. You treat your networking as code. You not only just networking, you can also start thinking about some of the other network services as well. So that's where I think where we think SDN is a great fit is the fact that as you create and deploy these dynamic applications, your SDN system follows that, right? You can create your networks, your virtual networks, very, very quickly. You can create them with policies. You can change things very quickly, and because it's all very programmable. So no longer, is the application team held back by what the network team can do with, the legacy approaches.
So you talked about this approach, and one of the things I'm curious about is how do you treat Docker containers, and any containers really, as those first-class citizens, along with VMs and bare metal and hosts, because I think that's kind of what is one of the, true challenges for companies is how do they use their existing infrastructure, which a lot of it is virtualized.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and that's kind of a thing where we come in is we started out to build cloud networks for VMs, right? That was how we started, and then we added, into the mix support for bare metal servers, and then when containers came along, some of the early approaches were kind of, what they did is they ended up creating silos out of these container environments, and we said, that's going to become problematic when you go to deploy, applications in the real world, right? Container-based applications are going to reach out to services running in VMs or bare metal servers. So how do you make sure you don't end up with these silos? So that's where what we did is we treat containers really no differently than we treat VMs, and the net result is that you can now stitch together these diverse environments, right, where containers can easily talk to VMs, they can talk to bare metal servers, and we can do all of this, using the policy-based framework that we have, right? That's really key, is we don't let go of any of those, and that's why we call them first-class citizens, is you can still do you still get all the policy enforcement that we, do, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but really that's where, containers become first-class citizens. And the other thing is that because our platform is built for cloud, then we can deal with the dynamic nature of these container environments, right? As they scale up and scale down, we can keep up with that and make sure that your network doesn't become the bottleneck.
So you sort of mentioned the policy component already. I thought maybe we could talk a little bit more about that, because policy management is just something that's come up time and time again in our conversations, not only as a way to correctly orchestrate the networking and storage components, but also seemingly a way to implement security by actually saying how things network and communicate, and seems to be a pretty core component to that, to messaging around security as well. So I wondered if you could maybe say a little bit more about Nuage Network's policy components.
Sure. This is Hari. I think one of the key things, as Harmeet was talking about, was we have a unified networking and security layer, and one of the core components is a policy layer that works in the same way across VMs or containers or bare metal. So a key component of the policy model that we have is we provide a centralized way to define the policies more closer to the user intent. So as an example of how our customers are using this policy model is for application deployments, they have a web tier and an app tier and a database tier, and you can actually group, logically label your different individual servers or containers based upon these logical grouping. So I can have my web tier talk to the app tier, and this can be easily specified through a policy, regardless of the actual IP address of the container or how the container is networked or where the container resides or where the VM resides, for example. So the policy model is powerful to more easily express the policies. And the second aspect of the policy is being able to define that centrally. So, if you've got a large environment where you have tens or hundreds of servers and each of them running several containers or microservices, being able to centrally define those policies and automate the actual policy distribution and enforcement is another key aspect of it. So we provide both the policy definition as well as the automation aspect, and we also provide native policy enforcement as well with our own embedded security capabilities. We can also enforce policies by steering traffic through third-party security services as well. So it's the overall automation of the policies as well as being able to specify this in a much more higher level that we offer as a part of our platform.
So what do you guys call your service? I mean, I know you have this virtual capability, and as I understand it, it's this, the VSP, the virtual routing and switching capability. What is the context for that when you're working in these complex container-based environments?
Sure, I can address that. So I think so VSP is really our overall platform, right? With the policy definition layer, and then there's an SDN controller component, and then there's the VRS that you refer to, which is our virtual routing and switching component. And now that piece runs on every container host, and that is really the thing that is going to glue together things, right? Which is going to provide you with multi-host networking, which is going to do the enforcement of policies. Now, what we do is, in terms of context for containers, we can do things like use labels that you attach to containers. For example, if your application spec, typically you'll use labels to pass around information. So you can use the same thing to specify policies as well, right? Or to specify the network itself. And then when the VRS, when the container is being spun up, then we will get that context from that attached to that container, and we will use that then to make sure we place the container in the right network, we download the right policies that apply to that container, and then make sure containers on one host can talk to containers wherever they are.
how do you guys get that context?
Sure. So, for example, I'll, get a little more sort of specific details. Could talk about the integration we've done with like Kubernetes, for example, right? So Kubernetes has the concept of, for example, network plugins, right? And so we have a network plugin for Kubernetes, and when a container or pod in this case actually is being brought up, that plugin is invoked, and then we know the container. We have a little bit more context. We know the namespace, for example, for that container, so we can then go query for those labels from the Kubernetes master, get the information we need, and then send that on to our controller to resolve the IP for that container, to get the security policies for that container, etc. So that's how we kind of tie in.
Ben, any thoughts?
Yeah, I sort of have a question here. You mentioned this networking plugin for Kubernetes. We've kind of been talking a lot about how we should cover specifically, well, networking plugins, but also plugins in general for how these tools are interacting and how people are actually implementing networking components. I'm curious how you guys approach plugins. You have a plugin for, well, you say Kubernetes, but for a lot of different solutions and platforms. I imagine for Docker itself, or maybe Docker Swarm. Maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but I'm curious where else this applies and kind of what you're covering and maybe what you're looking to cover in the future.
Yeah, definitely. No, we have multiple plugins. You're right. I mean, of course, I talked about the Kubernetes plugin, which also actually works in case of the OpenShift PaaS platform, which is based on Kubernetes. Then we have a plugin for Docker itself, of course. That's sort of the foundational block of all these orchestration systems. So we definitely have a plugin for Docker, and which also happens. We can also use that in different environments. It doesn't have to be used with just Docker Swarm. For example, we have customers who are using that with Mesos because they're using Docker containers with Mesos. So we can use the same plugin for Mesos. Now, yes, everyone, each of these ecosystems is kind of, moving very quickly. They're defining sort of their own ways of how they want to define the network APIs. And so we'll continue to evolve with that, right? Depending on, where we see, our customers moving to. So definitely, it's a dynamic environment, but, really what we've done is we embraced containers very early. And really started working with some very large customers. Last year itself, we wanted to be ahead of the game because we knew this was coming. When people are going to start operationalizing containers, they're going to look for solutions, right? So we wanted to be ahead, and we'll continue to evolve, really.
Yeah, the operations teams that are working with containers, there's kind of an interesting dynamic there because because containers work as for developers, but they also are increasingly used by operations teams. I'm curious on how how you marry like that integrated tool environment with your networking capabilities.
Yeah, definitely. So there's really different models we're seeing because there's no clear sort of single or one or two platforms have kind of emerged to kind of take over. But there's also mixed environments, right? So I'll give you an example of one of our deployments. So they have they've been using Cloud Stack, for example, for VMs, and they wanted to use Mesos for containers. And on top of this, they have their own sort of portal, right? So they have a self-service portal for their developers. And on one hand, they're driving things into Cloud Stack. The other side, they're driving things into Mesos. And then we become that unifying layer. So they're also talking to our controller, right, to set things up. So that's kind of how we've seen a model, which is interesting, which I think several other large organizations, at least, I expect them to go down that route, where they're going to have some sort of their API layer or orchestration layer, which is going to manage the infrastructure, for the operations teams.
Yeah, I guess one thing I'd probably add to this is from an operational perspective as well, we have built-in set of capabilities like being able to audit, being able to provide logging in terms of with the rich context that we have. So when we talk about applications, how these various tiers of microservices are communicating with each other. We have this as a part of our policy model, not only the ability to enforce policies, but also provide rich set of statistics around this that the operational teams can leverage to get more visibility into what's going on within their containerized environments.
Now let's take a quick break before we get back to the second half of the show. Nuage Networks is a sponsor of our ebook series on Docker and the container ecosystem. Learn more about Nuage and its perspectives on these timely and important topics in our latest ebook about networking, security, and storage in the Docker and container ecosystem. It's available for download at thenewstack.io. Now let's get back to the show.
I'm sort of curious, what kind of products that the virtualized services can work with and maybe what it can't. And maybe there's no good answer to this question. I don't know. I'll be curious. Is there any kind of messaging or partnership or integration you guys have with different platforms and infrastructure, maybe platforms as a service even, where essentially you can provide a service on top of that? Am I maybe wrong here?
So, we kind of fit in more, as at the infrastructure layer, right? So, we integrate into more ecosystems than the other way around in a way, right? So we integrate, for example, very well with OpenShift that I mentioned earlier, and also by the same token with Kubernetes. So that's kind of where we come in at the infrastructure layer. Now, within that, infrastructure sort of layer that we provide around networking and security, we, ourselves are a platform in a way, right? And so we have integration partners. So, for example, we, just, earlier this week, launched a joint solution with Citrix. Citrix is well known in the world of, load balancers. So they came out with a, containerized version of their load balancer called CPX, right? So we do have the ability to insert network services, which again, and Hari can touch upon that from a security aspect as well, because the operation teams are really going to want to see some of those integrations, right? So while we integrate sort of into the container ecosystems, there's integration sort of that we drive with our platform partners. Hari, do you want to add something?
I think you covered it, but I think the main thing here is around integrations. From a security perspective, I think there is ability to insert advanced security services for these container environments. Specifically, we are seeing when with customers like Betfair and others, they're embracing the DevOps model, and even more so in a containerized world, they need the same set of security controls for non-containerized workloads when they're deploying this in production. So, that means advanced security controls and being able to integrate with those for either compliance requirements or from an application requirement to have those kind of policies. So, we work with various security partners in the space like, Palo Alto or Checkpoint, Fortinet, being able to insert their security services. And that's applicable for containers as well as VM or bare metal workloads.
So my question then comes back to context again. And so how does Nuage provide contextual information, that helps from a security and visibility and monitoring perspective?
Sure, absolutely. So one of the benefits with the SDN policy-based model we have with Nuage platform or virtualized services platform is you basically describe a logical topology of the network. And as a part of the policy model, you provide rich context to say, rather than saying, I want to define this policy to allow communication between these IP addresses or between VLANs or subnets, You don't have none of that in the policy model. It's really a lot more logical, and you're specifying things in terms of application tiers and microservices. So the benefit of that is we carry that context, and we can provide back to the security teams and operational teams visibility of flows that are happening with this rich contextual view. So instead of just saying between these IPs, I'm seeing these flows, you can actually present a view that is between these application tiers or microservices. And this is a lot more important in a dynamic environment like in containers, because really containers may come and go, or you may scale up and scale down. So the individual container itself may be very short-lived. What you're really interested in is as a group, as a tier, how this tier is communicating with what other parts of the network, and that's where the context that you specify in our platform comes in, and it relates back, and we provide that in the visibility.
Beyond maybe the short lifespan of containers, is there any other specific difficulties that are kind of native to containers that maybe affect policy management or networking in your perspective? It's something that we ask a lot because a lot of these are not new issues, especially for people who are used to working with VMs. But I'm curious if there's anything inherent to containers that make it an extra layer or any features that are necessary for that.
Sure. Yeah, I think one of the things from container perspective is there's a lot more sharing than traditional with VMs, right? So how do you actually provide policies, and ultimately what customers are asking for is they want the application isolation, they want to provide microsegmentation in a container environment. So they need to be treated a bit differently when you have these on the same host, and you're bringing up these containers. So from a policy, how we do it, it's different for containers versus how we do it for VMs or bare metal. So that's one area where I think there is, from a policy standpoint, there's differences there.
Is the policy management, in your eyes, sort of if we do policy correctly, this is itself a form of security?
Yeah, I think that's definitely one layer of security. There is definitely, this is one layer, and it's a layer defense, right? So first you have to look at whether the container itself is secure, and there's tools out there that help with those, like scanning the containers, validating the container images that you're pulling from the repository. From a compliance perspective, sort of ongoing assessments. The policy that where we are focused on is really around from a network security perspective, making sure that we can enforce how these containers can talk with each other within the network. But this fits in as a part of an overall security that includes various things from a compute perspective, from scanning, from ongoing assessments, and so on.
Great. So from this perspective, what are some of the scenarios that you're preparing for? Like, how is, like, for example, how would the Nuage technology be applied, for example, if a container did get compromised?
Yeah, I think one of the this is a great use case, right? So with SDN, oftentimes what we see is this one piece of a server in the infrastructure or a virtual machine or a container may get compromised. And one of the challenges customers are concerned about, especially with some of the recent attacks, is to contain that with so it doesn't spread laterally to other parts of the infrastructure. And with the SDN approach, the policy-based control that we have, you can easily map those containers that's compromised, put them into a quarantine group or quarantine policy group, and essentially by doing so, you can have a predefined set of policies to say, hey, this container is likely infected. I don't want it to communicate with other parts of the infrastructure, or I want to monitor this a lot more closely. So steer the traffic through an IPS system to continue to monitor it, and provide much more granular security for those containers.
One question I have, and maybe might turn into a series of questions or a line of discussion here. In each ebook, we kind of like to cover how people are adopting containers in production environments and actually letting our readers know what others are doing, and maybe the best practices that are emerging there are important to us. And it sounds like you guys are sort of uniquely positioned in a way that I feel, or I suspect, many of your customers are probably actually utilizing containers in production environments. Maybe a two-part question here. I'm curious if they come to you largely as they're looking at managing these environments, or if it's a sort of preemptive measurement they take before they're actually going to be networking these environments, or is there a pattern there, or is it kind of all across the board?
It's across the board. It's kind of both scenarios that you describe, right? One, when people sort of are, hey, we want to now take these containers to production, what do we need to do, right? The others are kind of being a little bit more proactive and saying, containers are upon us, we need to get ready. So let me talk about the second group of people, because, we've been, doing SDN for a long time now. And so we've worked with a lot of customers and led them through, what does it mean to deploy SDN in production, right? So we have a lot of learning from those deployments, right? How do you do policy-based automation? Mm-hmm. How do you scale things up? How do you set up policies? How do you do multi-tenancy, right? One thing we haven't talked about is really, I think is critical, is multi-tenancy. And we've solved, all of those issues for a long time. And so now those customers are like, okay, you know what? Containers are going to be the next thing in that you need to support me for. And so they come to us and say, hey, and you know what? They also come to us for views on different ecosystems. They say, what is your take on this? How do you support, different ecosystems? And we give them our take. But at the same time, we tell them, like, we will support whatever environment you choose. But, because we're working across a bunch of customers, we start to see some patterns and use cases and all of that, right? So we can share those with them. And now the other guys who have come to us, because they were going to deploy containers, and they were like, okay, we've looked at the other solutions out there, and we've looked at yours as well, and we think we want to go with you. And for example, we did this test last year, spun up like 100,000 containers in Amazon into different, like, multi-tenanted fashion with policies as well, right? And we showed the scalability of our platform, right? And the stability of the platform. We could do resolve all of the policies in less than 10 minutes. And that brought us a lot of attention from customers who knew they had scaled environments, right? And people don't have scale on day one, but again, they want to make choices which they don't have to go back and change, right? And that's really what we're seeing is people, when they know they're going to get to scale scenarios, they're actually coming to us because they know we can build large networks.
And just one thing to add here, I think, is on the scalability front, right? Some of the large customers, these are like Fortune 50 companies that are rolling out containers in production. So scale is a big factor. And to sort of add something on a customer example for the first case is, we've got financial customers as one example. There's also pharmaceuticals. They have their legacy virtualized environment. I mean, it's running ESXi, for example. They've got some project on, OpenStack, where they are trying to do their own private cloud. And then they are building the next generation application infrastructure that is running on containers. And, when they start with us, they look at VMs and OpenStack and having a unified layer for this. but then they see that the same layer can do container networking and security as well, because that's one of our value prop to kind of work across these heterogeneous environments. So we're seeing customers both large scale in production and sort of the Fortune 50 type customers, as well as a lot of the enterprises, financials, and other sectors, industries where they're building their next gen application infrastructure with containers.
So that brings up a question for me about the requirements that are needed for these larger companies to bring containers into production. The need right now seems to be for not just like the smart technologies, but the people who understand how to, for instance, roll out containers and manage these very heterogeneous environments that a lot of these customers have. I'm curious on how you fit into that. So these are mission critical environments that need best of breed security policy, but you also need the people to know how to use these technologies in context with these new container environments.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the big benefits here from container orchestration system perspective, security is definition of security as a part of the application spec, and we're seeing more and more of those built in into the container orchestration layer itself, which is very good compared to for example in VMs, the security layer was added on from how these orchestration systems came in the first place, right? So we align very well with that. So I think as a part of the integration with orchestration systems such as Kubernetes or other orchestration systems, we can take the policies and map it to the policy model that we have. So the policy at an application layer and application spec talks about labels where these containers are fitting into specific labels, and they specify the allowed communication between these various containers. So that maps very well to our group-based policy model, where we can then use that to define policies and enforce them within our virtualized services platform. So I think there is natural alignment there from an application policy perspective to how it maps into our platform.
Then that brings some clarity, and it follows conversations we've had with people about the complexity of networking moving into these container orchestration platforms. So that's why the policy, becomes so relevant, right? You really need these policies, these dynamic policy environments, these contextual policy environments, for this new kind of model to work. And that seems to be, where it makes, Nuage relevant with Kubernetes and these other platforms.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there's doing this sort of in the traditional way is just not an option. I think individually configuring these policies so policy-based automation with a more logical grouping is a very natural way to address this. And that's one of the key value propositions that we offer with our platform, as well as our integrations with the container orchestration systems.
Well, Ben, I thought, is there a last question you'd like to ask? And then I'd like to ask Nuage just to, provide a last, statement about, where they see the market now. So Ben, any last questions here?
Two-part question. One is sort of a follow-up to these users that are entering production environments that you're talking to. That question there is there anything that they are still, that you can see or tell as far as, anything that they're still struggling with, any obstacles that you feel like customers even under your care are still having a hard time addressing and approaching in production environments? And two is maybe more of an open question, is just what have we not talked about that you think is really important to talk about for our readers especially? But let's talk about one first.
Yeah, let me address that. So, one of the things that it comes back to policy, and actually it comes back to the, developers versus the ops side kind of things. And more what people are telling us is give more and more controls to the developers so that they can create policies on the fly, and they don't have to come in, and ops doesn't have to get in the way. But the challenge still is that how do you make sure that, developers are, putting in the right policies, right? So that's sort of the give and take we're going through right now is, do you give full control to the developers and let them kind of drive things completely versus, and our platform is capable of doing that, but it just comes down to a philosophy that org wants to have versus the option where, your ops team kind of creates some predefined policies, and then application developers have to pick one, from those templates when they're kind of deploying their applications. So I think that's sort of one of the challenges, definitely, which I see most of our customers struggling with right now.
And the second question I had was really kind of an open-ended question for you guys, really. Is there anything we haven't talked about that you think is still important to address? You had actually mentioned multi-tenant environments earlier and that it was important to talk about that. I wondered if you had anything more to say there. That's something that we're kind of always looking to cover and be aware of.
Our platform is actually very, very, has a lot of capabilities, right? And the thing that people like about us is when they pick us, they don't get a solution for one environment and not something for the others, all right? Because what they don't want to do is create silos. Now, great use case for us is really hybrid cloud deployments, right? This is something, again, we can solve quite well. You can use Nuage for both, even with the public cloud, and of course for your private cloud, and we can manage those environments just the same way. But now think about the use case where you're running, let's say, containers in the public cloud because it's easy to spin things up. It's a new environment, and people are like, okay, if I'm going to do containers, let me go to the cloud. But then you have assets, right? You have your secure databases and things like that, which is in your data center. How do you connect these environments? And so Nuage has a security gateway. Again, it's all software that you can deploy in these public clouds, right? And you can deploy it in your data center, and you now get a very secure connection between those environments, and so you don't have to go, look somewhere else to solve those kind of issues, right? So we kind of take care of your networking and security end to end from that point of view.
Yeah, I think also from a multi-tenancy perspective as well. One of the key things is how do you isolate? If you're a large enterprise and you have different lines of businesses and they have their own set of applications, it doesn't have to be a service provider where you have multi-tenant requirements to essentially split customer environments. In large enterprise, this is also a very common requirement to say, my line of business A shouldn't have any access to other lines of business from an application perspective. Or another example is there is compliance requirements on certain set of applications. So you want to be able to isolate them. So the isolation is something that is inherent in the virtual networking capabilities that we provide that applies to containers as well as virtual machines.
Multi-tenant question is a big one, and it keeps coming up. So I would love to follow up on that topic with you guys another time. But I just want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us. We've been talking with the team from Nuage Networks. So thank you guys for participating. And Ben, thank you for joining us in this conversation. I've learned a lot, and we look forward to talking with you more, especially as we get ready to publish this ebook on networking, security, and storage in the Docker and container ecosystem. And thank you very much to Nuage for making that possible.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks a lot for having us here.
It's great to be here as always.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye. Nuage Networks is a sponsor of our ebook series on Docker and the container ecosystem. Learn more about Nuage and its perspectives on these timely and important topics in our latest ebook about networking, security, and storage in the Docker and container ecosystem. It's available for download at thenewstack.io. audio editing and sound design for the Newsstack Analyst podcast is provided by Broken Hours. You can find them at brokenhours.com. Thanks again, and hope to see you back at the show. Bye-bye.